Right now, you're one click away from knowing what's wrong with you. You've got pharmacies on every corner, antibiotics for infections, painkillers for pain. A whole industry built so you don't have to suffer very long. Now take all of that away. Not just the pills, the doctors, the knowledge, the words for what's happening inside your body. Just you, a body that hurts, and a world that has no concept of medicine yet. No pharmacist, no insurance claim, no waiting room where the TV is always playing the news. That used to be life. For 200,000 years, every human who got sick had to figure it out, or die. A broken bone, an infected tooth, a fever that wouldn't break. These weren't inconveniences. They were death sentences, or they should have been. How did they deal with it? How does a species with no medical schools, no labs, no written records of what works and what doesn't, figure out how to survive the things that are trying to kill them from the inside? Because the answer isn't what you'd expect, and some of it is still sitting in your medicine cabinet right now. Let's be honest about what we're actually assuming here. Because when most people think ancient medicine, they picture someone rubbing random leaves on a wound and hoping for the best, or chanting, maybe both. That's not what happened. And here's the thing nobody tells you. They didn't need a medical school. They had something better. 200,000 years of consequences. No journal, no peer review, no controlled study. But the most honest feedback system ever designed. It either worked, or you died. And the people who died didn't pass on what they tried. The people who lived did. Generation after generation, filtered by reality. Every treatment that made it to the next century had already survived a trial that no modern study can replicate. We think of medical knowledge as something that started when people started writing it down, around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago in Egypt and Mesopotamia. But by that point, humans had already been accumulating practical medical knowledge for nearly 200,000 years. We didn't invent medicine. We just started taking notes. Here's what nobody tells you. When you call ancient medicine primitive, you're forgetting that the feedback was real. You're forgetting that the people doing it had skin in the game. Literally. Wrong body, wrong treatment, worst possible outcome. So what did 200,000 years of that actually produce? Let's find out. It starts with teeth. Because nothing will tell you how practical someone was faster than whether they dealt with the thing causing them pain. 9,000 years ago, in a place called Mehrgar, in what is now Pakistan, someone sat down and had a tooth drilled. The drill was a sharpened piece of flint. The anesthetic was probably nothing, and we know this procedure happened because in 2006, researchers published the discovery in Nature, 11 molars, dated to around 9,000 years ago, each showing the characteristic cone shape of a bow drill operation. Here's the counterintuitive part. The teeth didn't get worse. There were no signs of additional infection spreading from the drilling sites. Meaning, they didn't just drill, they drilled correctly. Their dentist was a piece of flint. And somehow, that was enough. And if they had figured out dentistry 9,000 years ago, what else were they treating? Because pain and fever don't wait for you to invent a medical system. They show up immediately. Which brings us to the thing that's probably in your bathroom right now. The Sumerians, around 4,000 years ago, were pressing willow bark against wounds and boiling it into drinks for fever and pain. We know this from clay tablets in what is now Iraq, part of collections now held in places like the British Museum. The Egyptians wrote it down too, in the papyrus Ebers, dated to around 1550 BC, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world. 110 pages. Over 700 remedies. Willow bark, salicylic acid, listed for reducing fever and pain. Hippocrates, around 400 BC, recommended a tea from willow leaves to help women manage pain during childbirth. In 1897, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann at Bayer synthesized acetyl salicylic acid from salicylic acid. They called it aspirin, put a logo on it. Sold it to the world as a new discovery. Next time you take one for a headache, you're following a prescription that's 4,000 years old. Bayer just added the branding. We're only getting started. The question isn't whether they had medicine. The question is how far ahead they actually were. Here's where it gets interesting. Somewhere between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, across sites in France, Peru, Ukraine, and several other places, ancient humans were performing brain surgery. Not metaphorically, they were drilling or scraping holes in living people's skulls. The procedure is called Trephination, and you'd expect the survival rate to be around 0. It wasn't. At sites like Ensisheim in France, dated to around 5100 BC, and among the Paracas culture in Peru, around 2000 BC, researchers found skulls showing bone regrowth around the edges of the holes. Bone takes months to grow back. That means these patients didn't die on the table. They lived long enough afterward for their bodies to start healing. John Verano at Tulane University, studying Peruvian trephination cases, found survival rates ranging from around 50 to 70%. Let that sit for a moment. They were drilling holes in people's skulls with stone tools, and more than half the patients made it. That's not luck. That's technique. But here's where it gets stranger. They might not have learned all of this from each other. They might have learned some of it from watching chimpanzees. In the late 1980s, a primatologist named Michael Huffman at the Kyoto University Primate Research Institute was observing chimpanzees in Tanzania when he noticed something. A sick chimp, visibly lethargic, with gut parasites, walked past the plants it normally ate to specifically seek out the leaves of Vernonia amygdalina. This plant is intensely bitter. Chimps avoid it when they're healthy, but this one chewed it, swallowed the bitter juice, and within 20 to 30 hours, the parasite load in its gut dropped significantly. This wasn't random. The chimp knew something was wrong, went looking for something specific, and found it. Huffman called this zoopharmacognosy, or, more simply, the self-medication hypothesis. Animals observing their own bodies, pattern matching to what helps, and acting on it. If chimpanzees were doing this, our closest living relatives, then Homo sapiens, with considerably larger brains and a much longer cultural memory, had almost certainly been doing the same thing and passing the knowledge on for far longer. But wait, you might say, couldn't the Trephination survivors have just gotten lucky? Maybe they would have survived anyway? Here's why that doesn't hold up. The skulls with bone regrowth around drill holes aren't rare outliers. They show up across multiple continents, across thousands of years, with consistent technique. The same procedures, refined. That's not luck repeated across millennia. That's a skill being taught. So they learned by observation, by trial, by the survival of whoever got it right. But did this actually accumulate into something meaningful? In 1991, hikers in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy found a body preserved in ice. They called him Ötzi. He had been lying there for approximately 5,300 years. When researchers examined what he was carrying and what was in his body, they found something extraordinary. Ötzi had intestinal parasites, specifically Trichuris trichura, a type of whipworm. He also had hardened arteries, Lyme disease indicators, and a joint condition that was causing him pain in his knees, lower back, and ankles. And he had targeted treatments for at least 3 of those conditions. He was carrying pieces of Piptoporus betulinus, a bracket fungus found on the birch trees. Analysis confirmed it has anti-parasitic and laxative properties that would have directly addressed his whipworm infection. He was carrying tinder fungus and other plants with medicinal applications. And then there were the tattoos. 61 marks, placed at precise locations on his body, his knees, his ankles, his lower back. 80% of those locations correspond to acupuncture points in traditional Chinese medicine. Ötzi predates the earliest Chinese acupuncture records by about 2,000 years. Here's what gets me. He didn't know what a parasite was. He didn't have a word for anti-parasitic. He just knew that specific mushroom made him feel better. And he was right. Consistently, verifiably, chemically right. He wasn't surviving despite the lack of medicine. He was medicine, walking through the Alps carrying a portable pharmacy targeted to his specific, documented conditions. That's not primitive. That's precision. We have a tendency to assume that what we don't understand must be random, that ancient people treating illness were guessing. But Ötzi is a single person, preserved by accident, and his medical kit lines up with what was actually wrong with him. The probability of that being coincidence is not high. What he represents isn't one smart individual. He represents the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of people paying close attention to plants, to bodies, to what worked, and passing it forward. Here's the kicker. Around 1550 BC, Egyptian physicians were doing something that, on paper, makes no sense. When treating infected wounds, they sometimes applied moldy bread or wrapped wounds in linen that had developed mold on it. They didn't know why it worked. No one had discovered bacteria yet, No one had the framework to explain it. But it worked. And they kept doing it because it worked. The active ingredient, we now know, was Penicillium mold, the same mold that Alexander Fleming famously observed in his London laboratory in September 1928, growing on a petri dish and killing the bacteria around it. He called it a discovery. It was. It was also 3,000 years late. They stumbled into penicillin, and because they couldn't mass produce it, they couldn't overuse it. They never created the conditions for antibiotic resistance. They never built an industrial system around a biological mechanism that was never designed to be used at industrial scale. We did. According to the World Health Organization, at least 1.27 million people now die directly from antibiotic-resistant infections every year. We took the most important medical discovery of the 20th century and, within 80 years, started breaking it. Meanwhile, the aspirin story closes its loop. Willow bark for 4,000 years. Hoffman synthesizes it in 1897. It becomes the most widely used drug in human history. We added the manufacturing. We didn't add the insight. The insight was already there, pressed into a clay tablet by someone in Mesopotamia who just knew that willow bark helped. They figured out what worked. We figured out how to make more of it. That's a meaningful distinction, especially now that more of it is creating problems they never had. Here's the part that stays with me. Every treatment in your medicine cabinet has a version that is thousands of years old. The aspirin, the honey for a sore throat, the ginger for nausea, the way you instinctively put pressure on a cut. These aren't old wives' tales. They're the surviving output of the world's longest, most ruthlessly honest clinical trial. The trial started 200,000 years ago. Everyone who tested something that didn't work didn't make it this far. Every piece of knowledge that reached you, through grandmothers, through ancient texts, through the long chain of people who tried things and lived, survived because it was actually useful. You're not just taking medicine, you're the surviving end product of 200,000 years of careful observation. The trial began before language, before writing, before anyone had a word for what they were doing. They didn't call it medicine, they just called it surviving. Next time you reach for an aspirin, or a spoonful of honey on a sore throat, you're not doing something ancient, you're continuing something ancient. There's a difference. What's the oldest remedy you still use? Honey for a cough? Ginger for nausea? Garlic for everything? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what's been passed down in your family. And if this made you think differently about what medicine really means, click the next video, because the rabbit hole goes a lot deeper than aspirin.